I remember the exact second my life split in two. I was standing on the observation deck of Orbital Station Meridian, 200 miles above the Pacific Ocean, watching a school shuttle cross the upper atmosphere. My daughter Lily was on that shuttle, heading back from a field trip to the Lunar Observatory. I had a cup of coffee in one hand and a maintenance report in the other, and then the stars started going out. Not slowly, not one at a time the way you might imagine. They vanished in clusters, like someone was pulling a curtain across the sky from every direction at once. I dropped the coffee. The cup floated away in the low gravity, spinning brown liquid into the air, and I did not move. I just stood there and watched the darkness eat the universe. The alarms started 30 seconds later. Every alarm on every station, every ship, every colony, from Mercury to the research outposts on Titan. All at once. The same sound. The same warning. Unknown contact. Massive signature. Closing fast. I was Admiral Daniel Harding, commander of the 7th Deep Space Fleet. I had spent 23 years in the United Earth Navy. I had trained for pirate interdiction, asteroid defense, colony disputes, and every kind of emergency a military officer is supposed to prepare for. Nobody had trained me for this. Nobody could have. The Velthari Dominion arrived in our solar system at 1400 hours, Earth Standard Time, on the 11th of March 2347. Their fleet numbered over 12,000 warships. 12,000. We counted them as they phased into real space, their ships appearing out of nothing, like a wall of iron pushing through wet paper. They came in formation, every vessel precisely positioned, and the formation itself was so vast that it blocked the light from entire constellations. Their lead vessel was the size of a small moon. Our sensors could not even get a full reading on it, because it was too large for our instruments to process in one sweep. I ran to the command center. Every screen was showing the same thing: the fleet, the formation, and then the message. It played on everything. Every screen, every speaker, every personal device on Earth, and across every human settlement in the solar system. A figure appeared. Tall, insectoid, 6 limbs, a head like a dark crown of bladed bone, eyes that reflected no light. It spoke, and whatever technology it used, translated its words into every human language simultaneously. The voice was flat, patient, the way you might speak to an insect before you step on it. The creature called itself Urath Kel, High Sovereign of the Velthari Dominion. It said that our solar system had been surveyed, catalogued, and assigned a designation. We were pre-compliant species 4471. It said that Earth and all human holdings were now property of the Dominion. It listed the terms. We were to disarm every military vessel within 72 hours. Every planetary and colonial leader was to surrender themselves to Velthari custody for processing. Every human being would be genetically catalogued and assigned a labor function based on physical and cognitive capability. There was no negotiation. There was no offer. It was a sentencing. Urath Kel mentioned, as though it were a minor detail, that any failure to comply would result in what the Dominion called atmospheric correction. I did not know what that meant at the time. I learned later. It meant burning the surface of a world until there was nothing left alive. The Velthari had done this 31 times before, to species that refused to kneel. The message ended, the screens went dark, and for about 90 seconds, the entire human race held its breath. I stood in that command center, surrounded by officers who had never looked afraid in their lives. Every single one of them was afraid now. Not of dying. We were military. We understood dying. They were afraid because the math did not work. 12,000 advanced warships against a human fleet of maybe 300 combat-ready vessels. Our ships were good. Our crews were good. But this was not a fight. This was arithmetic. And the numbers said we were already finished. The first hour was chaos. Panic spread through the civilian networks faster than any virus. People on Earth flooded the streets. Some were screaming. Some were praying. Emergency shelters overflowed in minutes. On Mars, the colonial government declared martial law before the message had even finished playing. On Europa, a research station went completely silent. And we later learned that every person on board had simply sat down in the common room and waited. Just waited. Like the world had already ended, and they were watching the last light fade. But then something happened. Something that I think no alien species would ever predict, because it is so deeply and stupidly human that you would have to be born on this stubborn little planet to understand it. People got angry. I watched it happen in real time on the communication feeds. A dock worker on Titan, a big man with grease on his face and a wrench in his hand, looked straight into a camera and said, "They can come down here and try." A teacher on Mars stopped her evacuation and turned her classroom into a planning center. Students who were crying 5 minutes earlier were suddenly building signal jammers out of spare parts. Engineers on Luna pulled old military schematics from sealed archives, files that had been classified for decades, and started running calculations. A retired pilot on Earth, 74 years old, walked into a recruitment center and told them she could still fly anything with an engine. Fear had hit us like a wave, but humanity does this thing that I have never seen in any intelligence briefing about any other species in the galaxy. We take fear and we squeeze it until it turns into something else entirely. Call it defiance. Call it stubbornness. Call it whatever you want. The Velthari called us cattle. We were about to show them what cattle could do when they decided they were done being herded. 14 hours into the countdown, I received a priority summons. Not from Fleet Command, not from the United Earth Council, from a source that, according to every database I had access to, did not exist. The coordinates pointed to a location beneath the Mariana Exclusion Zone, a restricted sector of the Pacific floor that was officially listed as a geological monitoring station. I took a stealth transport down alone. When I arrived, I was escorted through a facility that went deeper into the Earth than I thought was possible. The walls changed from metal to reinforced stone to something I did not recognize. The air got colder, the lights got dimmer, and at the very bottom, in a room carved out of the planet itself, I met a woman named Claire Ashton. She was the director of a project called Deepwell. She had no rank that I could find, no service record, no public identity. She existed in a space between classified and imaginary, and she looked at me with the calmest eyes I have ever seen on a human being, and said, "Sit down, Admiral. Everything you think you know about our situation is wrong." She told me that humanity had known contact was coming for over 150 years. In 2198, a deep space telescope had detected a Velthari scout vessel passing through the outer solar system. The scout never noticed us. Our technology was too primitive to register on their sensors, but we noticed them, and from that moment, everything changed. For the next century and a half, humanity had been quietly, secretly, desperately preparing. We intercepted alien transmissions. We studied debris. We reverse-engineered fragments of technology that our probes collected from the outer reaches of the system. We cracked principles of physics that would have taken us another 1,000 years to discover on our own. And with all of that knowledge, all of that time, all of that fear turned into fuel. We built something. Claire Ashton said 2 words that rearranged every molecule in my body. She said, "Black Armada." I asked her what that meant. She pulled up a display that showed a region of space beyond the Oort cloud, so far from the sun that light from our star was just another dim point in the dark. And there, hidden in the deepest black that the universe had to offer, was a fleet. Not 300 ships, not 500, over 8,000 warships, built in secret across 3 generations, painted in materials that absorbed every wavelength of light, running on reactors that produced no heat signature, invisible to every known form of detection in the galaxy. She told me that our visible fleet, the 300 ships that the Velthari had scanned and dismissed, had been kept deliberately small and outdated. It was a mask, a scarecrow, a lie that humanity had maintained for decades, so that when the day finally came, when the Dominion arrived and looked at our defenses, they would see exactly what they expected to see. A helpless species, easy prey. Claire looked at me and said, "We need a commander, Admiral. Someone who can lead 8,000 ships against 12,000 and win. The Council chose you." I sat in that underground room for a long time. I thought about Lily on that school shuttle. I thought about the dock worker on Titan. I thought about 12,000 alien warships in our sky, and the flat, patient voice of a creature that thought we were nothing. I said yes. I boarded a stealth transport that night. It took me outward, past Jupiter, past Saturn, past Neptune, and the frozen silence beyond Pluto, into the true dark, where the sun disappeared behind me, and the cold pressed against the hull like a living thing. I did not sleep. I sat in the forward compartment and watched the emptiness, and thought about what we were about to do. Not whether we could win, whether we deserved to. Every species the Velthari had ever conquered had faced the same choice. Kneel, every single one had either submitted or been destroyed. 200 civilizations across 3,000 years. Not one had ever fought back and survived. Not one. We were going to be the first, or we were going to be the 32nd species to have our world burned to glass. The transport crossed an energy threshold about 6 hours past the Kuiper Belt. The instruments flickered. The hull hummed. And then the dark outside the viewport changed. It was not empty anymore. I saw them. The Black Armada. They stretched across the void in every direction. Thousands of ships hanging in the black like sleeping predators. They made no light. They reflected nothing. They were holes in the darkness. Shapes you could only see because the faint starlight behind them was missing. Destroyers, cruisers, carriers, dreadnoughts. And at the center of the formation, the largest warship humanity had ever built, the flagship that would carry me into the most important battle in the history of our species. They had named it the Defiance. Of course they had. Because that is what we are. That is all we have ever been. I docked with the Defiance and stepped aboard, and in that moment, standing on the bridge of a ship that officially did not exist, surrounded by a fleet that the galaxy did not know was there, I understood what humanity had been doing for the last 150 years. We had not been hiding. We had not been cowering. We had been loading the largest gun in the history of civilization, and the Velthari had just given us a reason to pull the trigger. The Defiance was a cathedral of war. I walked her corridors for 3 hours before I even reached the bridge. Railgun batteries lined her flanks, each one capable of firing a tungsten slug at a fraction of the speed of light. Drone bays sat in her belly, holding millions of autonomous units no bigger than a clenched fist. The weapons labs were sealed and marked with codes I had never seen, housing technology that the briefing files described only in careful, clinical terms. Gravity lances, singularity torpedoes, and one system listed simply as Herald, painted in red on a locked door at the lowest level of the ship. I asked Claire what Herald was. She was on board, overseeing final preparations. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Pray we never have to find out." I did not push. I had enough to worry about. The crews of the Black Armada were not what I expected. I had assumed they would be special forces, elite units pulled from the best academies and training programs on Earth. They were not. They were everyone. Teachers who had learned to pilot warships in simulators hidden beneath school buildings. Miners from the asteroid belt who understood zero-gravity combat because they had spent their lives working in the void. Engineers who had designed weapons in classified labs during the day and gone home to their families at night, never speaking a word about what they were building. A 70-year-old woman named Margaret Lane, who commanded an entire destroyer wing because she had spent 40 years running combat simulations that nobody else even knew existed. I met them. I shook their hands. I looked into their eyes and saw the same thing in every single one of them. Not confidence, not bravery, something rawer than that. Refusal. The absolute, bone-deep, unshakable refusal to let this be the end of the human story. The battle plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Velthari expected one of two things. Either humanity would surrender before the deadline, or we would mount a desperate, futile last stand with our visible fleet. They were watching Earth. They were watching Mars. They were watching every human settlement in the solar system, waiting for the white flag or the final charge. They were not watching the dark behind them. The Black Armada would use a series of gravitational slingshot maneuvers to approach Sol space from the galactic south, a vector that the Velthari considered empty because no species had ever used it for a military approach. The attack would happen at the 71st hour of the ultimatum, 1 hour before the deadline. Maximum surprise, maximum chaos. I gathered my senior officers and went over every detail until we could recite the plan in our sleep. Captain Kate Murray, my tactical officer, a woman who had lost her parents to a mining accident and joined the Armada because, as she put it, she wanted to give the universe a reason to remember us. Chief Engineer George Palmer, who had built half the weapon systems on the Defiance and talked to the ship like she was alive. Lieutenant Commander Nora Bishop, the drone swarm specialist, who described her million-unit swarm with the kind of quiet pride that told me she had spent years perfecting every single one of them. These people were not soldiers by birth. They were soldiers by choice, and that made them more dangerous than any trained army in the galaxy. The night before we launched, I recorded a message for Lily. I did not tell her where I was. I did not tell her what I was about to do. I just said that I was proud of her, that I loved her, and that everything I was doing was so that she would never have to live in a galaxy where someone could tell her to kneel. I stared at the recording for 10 minutes before I sent it. Then I walked to the bridge, sat in the command chair, and gave the order. All engines forward. 8,000 ships ignited their drives at the same moment. The void behind the Oort cloud flared with light that no living thing would ever see, a brief and silent fire in the deepest dark. The Black Armada moved toward home. The transit took 11 hours. We moved in absolute silence. No transmissions, no active sensors, no running lights. 8,000 ships gliding through the black like sharks through deep water, invisible and patient. The crews were quiet. Some wrote letters. Some sat alone with their thoughts. A group of pilots from the carrier Resolute played cards in their ready room, and I was told later that they played the same hand for 6 hours straight because nobody could concentrate enough to finish. I did not sleep. I stood on the bridge of the Defiance and monitored the intercepted Velthari communications that our passive receivers were picking up from Sol space. What I heard made my blood slow and my jaw tighten. The Velthari were already dividing Earth. They had assigned overseers to every continent. They had drafted labor quotas for the Martian colonies. They had designated Europa as a fuel extraction site and Titan as a waste processing zone. They were discussing which human genetic profiles would be most useful for manual labor and which would be culled as inefficient. One Velthari officer, in a transmission to his subordinate, described humanity as primitive in a way that made it clear he considered us less than animals. Another transmission, from a tactical commander aboard their lead vessel, noted that our visible fleet was equivalent to what they called a pre-spacefaring militia. The exact words, translated by our systems, were, "The primates have crude fusion drives. This is not a conquest. This is pest control." I saved that transmission. I wanted to play it for them later. While we moved through the dark, Earth played its role perfectly. The United Earth Council broadcast a response to the Velthari that was carefully designed to look like confusion and weakness. They asked for an extension of the deadline. They appeared to argue among themselves on open channels. Political leaders made contradictory statements. Military commanders issued conflicting orders. All of it was scripted. Every word, every argument, every display of disunity was a performance designed to keep the Velthari looking inward, focused on the chaos below them, and not outward into the dark, where 8,000 warships were closing the distance. Behind the performance, the real work was happening. Civilians were being moved to deep shelters carved into mountain ranges and ocean floors. The visible defense fleet repositioned itself in a pattern that looked like a desperate last stand, but was actually a carefully planned withdrawal route designed to pull the Velthari fleet into a specific formation. Every piece was being placed on the board. Every move had been rehearsed for decades. I spent the transit hours studying the Velthari, not just their fleet composition or their weapons, but their history, their psychology. I read intelligence reports that Deepwell had compiled over 150 years of observation, and what I found was both reassuring and chilling. The Velthari Dominion had conquered over 200 species across 9,000 star systems. Their method never changed. They arrived with overwhelming force, issued their ultimatum, and waited. Species that surrendered were enslaved. Species that fought were destroyed. The pattern was so consistent that it had become ritual. The Velthari did not even consider resistance a realistic possibility anymore. They had not fought an actual battle in over 400 years. Their fleet was enormous. Their technology was advanced, but their tactics were frozen in time. They had become so accustomed to easy victories that they had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy that could fight back. That was their weakness, not their ships, not their weapons, their certainty. They were so sure that we would break, that they had stopped preparing for the possibility that we would not. I shared this analysis with my officers during a briefing 6 hours into the transit. Kate Murray studied the tactical data and said, "They have better shields, better energy weapons, and more ships. But they are predictable. They fight the same way every time, Because every time has worked. We just need to make sure this time is different. George Palmer looked up from his engineering console and said, "Their shields are designed to stop energy weapons. Every species they have conquered used energy-based technology. Nobody has ever hit them with a railgun." He smiled when he said it. It was not a kind smile. Nora Bishop was quieter. She pulled up schematics of the Velthari warship designs and pointed to specific features, sensor arrays, engine intakes, communication nodes, and said, "These are designed for large-scale engagement, ship against ship. They have no point defense systems for small targets. Nothing that can track and destroy objects smaller than a shuttle." She paused. "My drones are the size of a fist." Kate said no. George said the ship was ready, and that was enough. Nora said she had already written her letters. Margaret Lane, the 70-year-old destroyer commander, was patched in via secure channel from her ship, the Gallant. She listened to the entire briefing in silence. When I asked for her input, she said, "I have been waiting for this my entire life, Admiral. Every simulation I ever ran, every scenario I ever studied, it was all for this moment. I am not going to waste it." We settled into the gravitational shadow of a dwarf planet on the outer edge of the system, just beyond the detection range of the Velthari sensors. Every ship powered down to minimal systems. The silence was so complete that I could hear the cooling system cycling in the walls of the bridge. I could hear my own pulse. I checked the clock. 3 hours remained on the ultimatum. In 3 hours, the Velthari expected humanity to kneel. In 3 hours, they were going to learn that they had made the worst mistake in the history of their empire. Drone swarms activated and held in standby. Across 8,000 ships, hundreds of thousands of human beings prepared to fight for the survival of their species. Nobody spoke louder than a whisper. Nobody needed to. At the 71st hour, 1 hour before the deadline, I opened a channel to the entire fleet. I had thought about what to say for days. I had considered grand speeches, historical references, stirring words about duty and honor and sacrifice. I threw all of it away. These people did not need a speech. They needed the truth. I said, "They came to our home and told us to kneel. They picked the wrong species. In 1 hour, they are going to learn why the universe should have left us alone. All ships, go dark. And when I give the word, show them everything." 8,000 ships cut their last running lights. Navigation markers went black. Sensor emissions dropped to zero. The Black Armada became invisible. 8,000 weapons hanging in the void, indistinguishable from empty space. The final hour began. I stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the clock count down. Around me, the bridge crew sat at their stations with the kind of focused stillness that only comes when people have accepted what is about to happen and have decided to meet it head-on. Kate Murray had her tactical display open, tracking the Velthari fleet in real time through passive sensors. George Palmer was running final diagnostics on every weapon system, his fingers moving across his console with the speed and precision of a musician. Nora Bishop sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, her hand resting on the deployment switch that would release her swarms. The Velthari were celebrating. I could see it on the intercepts. They had begun broadcasting ceremonial music across their fleet, a tradition that accompanied every successful conquest. They were so confident that some of their ships had actually powered down their secondary shields. Why waste energy protecting yourself from something that cannot hurt you? At 10 minutes, I ordered the fleet to begin its final approach. 8,000 ships moved forward in perfect formation, engines running at minimum power, gliding toward the Velthari fleet like a shadow sliding across the floor. No sound, no light, no warning. At 5 minutes, I felt my hands begin to shake. I pressed them flat against the arms of the command chair and held them there. I thought about Lily. I thought about every child on Earth, on Mars, on every colony and station across the system. I thought about the dock worker on Titan with the wrench in his hand. I thought about the teacher on Mars and her students building signal jammers. I thought about every human being who had looked up at the sky in the last 72 hours and chosen anger over surrender. At 1 minute, I opened the fleet channel. I took one breath. The bridge was so quiet I could hear my heart beating. At 0, I said one word. Now. The void behind the Velthari fleet came alive. 8,000 ships lit their weapons simultaneously, and the darkness that the Dominion had been ignoring for 72 hours erupted into a wall of fire and fury that turned the black of space into something that looked like a second sun being born. The opening salvo was railgun fire. Thousands upon thousands of tungsten slugs, each one the size of a refrigerator, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light and hurled into the rear of the Velthari formation. The Velthari shields, those beautiful, sophisticated energy barriers designed to deflect beams and plasma and every weapon that 200 conquered species had ever used, shattered like glass under a hammer, because they had never been hit with a solid object moving that fast. No species had ever been primitive enough to still use kinetic weapons. No species had ever been clever enough to realize that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. In the first 90 seconds, over 400 Velthari ships went dark. Their formations, so elegant, so precise, so carefully arranged, broke apart like a flock of birds hit by a stone. Commanders screamed orders that contradicted each other. Ships that had powered down their secondary shields scrambled to bring them back online. The ceremonial music cut off mid-note and was replaced by the sound of alarms. I watched the chaos unfold on the tactical display and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not triumph, relief. Because the plan was working. Because we had surprised them. Because for the first time in 3,000 years, the Velthari Dominion was experiencing something that they had made 200 other species feel. Fear. Kate Murray called out targets with a voice as steady as a heartbeat. She directed the fleet with a precision that made the Velthari look clumsy by comparison, rotating attack wings in and out of engagement, concentrating fire on command ships and communication nodes, cutting the enemy fleet into pieces that could not coordinate. George Palmer kept the Defiance running at peak efficiency, rerouting power faster than the damage could accumulate, patching systems with improvised solutions that no engineer would have attempted under normal circumstances. He later told me that he talked to the ship the entire time. He told her to hold together. He told her she was strong enough. And she was. Nora Bishop deployed her swarms. Millions of drones, each one no bigger than a clenched fist, poured from the bays of every carrier in the fleet and flooded into the Velthari formation like a storm of metal. They were too small for the Velthari weapons to track. They were too numerous to shoot down. They crawled across the hulls of enemy ships, found their way into engine intakes and sensor arrays and communication arrays, and detonated. Each one carried a charge barely strong enough to crack a wall. Together, they hollowed ships from the inside out. The Velthari had no defense, because they had never imagined a weapon this small, this numerous, or this relentless. The battle raged for hours. The Velthari recovered from their initial shock faster than I had hoped. Their energy weapons found our ships. I watched 3 cruisers vanish in a single beam, there 1 second and gone the next, and I felt each loss like a wound in my own body. The Defiance took a direct hit that tore through 4 decks and sent a shockwave through the entire ship. I was thrown from the command chair. When I got back up, the damage reports were flooding in. Fires on 6 decks, hull breaches on 2 more, casualties I could not count yet. For 20 terrible minutes, the battle hung in the balance. The Velthari outnumbered us. Their weapons hit harder. Their ships were bigger. The mathematics that had terrified my officers 72 hours ago began reasserting itself in the cruelest possible way. For every enemy ship we brought down, 2 more filled the gap. Our losses mounted. The Black Armada was bleeding. But we did not break. And the reason we did not break is the same reason the Velthari had never understood us, and never would. Humanity does not fight by the rules. We do not follow doctrine. We do not accept the outcome that mathematics says is inevitable. We cheat. We improvise. We do things that no trained military in the galaxy would consider sane, and we do them with such speed and conviction that by the time the enemy realizes what is happening, it is already over. Captains began using their own damaged ships as shields, positioning crippled vessels between functional ones and the Velthari beams. Engineering teams rerouted power through pathways that the ship designers had never intended. A navigation officer on the cruiser Steadfast realized that the Velthari shields flickered for 1/10 of a second during their recharge cycle and broadcast the timing to the entire fleet. Within minutes, every gunner in the Armada was firing in sync with that flicker, punching shots through gaps that were supposed to be invisible. A cargo hauler, a converted freight ship called the Honest Work, with welded-on guns, and a crew of 12, broke formation and charged directly at a Velthari destroyer 3 times its size. The captain, a former merchant pilot named Eddie Shaw, broadcast an old song from Earth over an open channel as he went. The song was something from centuries ago, something fast and loud, and full of the kind of reckless energy that only humans have ever produced. The Honest Work hit the destroyer head-on. Both ships disappeared in a flash of light that lit up the battle for miles. I did not know Eddie Shaw. I never met him, but I will remember his name for the rest of my life. The turning point came when the Throne of Obedience, the Velthari flagship, began charging its atmospheric correction weapon, the same weapon that had burned 31 worlds. It was pointed at Earth. I saw the energy readings spike on Kate Murray's display, and for 1 second, I felt something close to true despair. Then I remembered the contingency. 3 stealth frigates had been running completely dark since the battle began, moving on a separate course toward the throne, while the rest of the fleet engaged the Velthari Armada. They had been invisible, patient, waiting. I gave the order, and they fired from point-blank range, singularity torpedoes, weapons that generated micro-black holes lasting fractions of a second, tiny points of gravity so intense that they pulled matter apart at the atomic level. They hit the Throne of Obedience along its central spine. The largest warship in the Velthari Dominion folded inward. Its shields, designed to stop anything coming from the outside, could not stop a weapon that created gravity on the inside. The hull crumpled like paper. The atmospheric correction weapon went dark. And in the heart of that collapsing ship, Urith Kell, the High Sovereign who had ordered humanity to kneel, ceased to exist. The effect on the Velthari fleet was immediate and total. They had never lost a flagship. They had never lost a sovereign. Their formation did not just break. It shattered. Ships began retreating, first in small groups, then in waves, then in a full, uncontrolled rout. I could hear it on the intercepts. Velthari commanders screaming at their crews to hold position, crews ignoring the orders and running. The predators who had never fought an equal were discovering what it felt like to be prey. I did not order pursuit, not full pursuit. I sent fast attack wings to harass the retreat, to make sure they kept running, but I did not try to destroy the fleeing ships. I wanted them to survive. I wanted them to go home. I wanted them to walk into the halls of the Velthari Dominion and tell every single member of their species what had happened here, what Earth had done, what humanity was capable of when someone tried to make us kneel. The battle was over. We had won, and the cost was carved into my soul. I walked the corridors of the Defiance afterward. The ship was wounded, leaking atmosphere in places, lit by emergency lighting in others. I passed crews carrying their fallen. I passed damage control teams working in silence, their faces blank with exhaustion. I visited the medical bays and saw rows of wounded stretching into the distance, and I spoke to as many of them as I could. I told them they had saved Earth. I told them they had saved every human being alive. Most of them smiled when I said it. Some of them cried. 2,200 ships of the Black Armada had been lost. Over 370,000 human beings were gone. Pilots, engineers, Marines, teachers, miners, parents, children of someone. Every one of them had volunteered. Every one of them had known the odds, and every one of them had come anyway, because they decided that a free future was worth more than a safe surrender. I stood in a ruined observation deck at the bow of the Defiance and looked out at Earth through the shattered viewport. The planet was still there, blue and white and green, spinning in the sunlight, alive and whole and free. I put my hand on the cold metal frame and I cried. Not because we had won, because of what it had taken, because of who we had lost, because victory is not a clean thing, and the people who tell you otherwise have never paid its price. As the last Velthari ships fled soul space, trailing smoke and fear, something happened that I did not order and could not have predicted. Every human settlement in the solar system, every station, every colony, every ship, every outpost from Mercury to the farthest research base on the edge of the belt, activated their external lights at the same time. Not a signal, not a code, just light. 100 billion watts of defiance, blazing across the system like a constellation made by human hands. I stood on that broken observation deck and watched the solar system glow, and I whispered the only words that mattered. We held. The days after the battle were a blur of grief and purpose. We buried our dead, we read their names, we built memorials on every world and station and ship that had lost someone. The names filled walls, filled databases, filled the silence of empty quarters, where someone was never coming home. Earth mourned. Mars mourned. Every colony from the inner planets to the outer dark lowered its lights for 24 hours in remembrance. But even as we mourned, we worked, because we knew, with the cold certainty of people who have stared into the face of extinction and survived, that the Velthari were not finished. I was right. Within weeks, intercepted transmissions confirmed what we feared. Urith-Kel's successor, a Velthari commander named Cyrith Voss, had declared humanity a primary-level threat to the Dominion. The designation was unprecedented. In 3,000 years of conquest, the Velthari had never considered any species dangerous enough to warrant that classification. Cyrith Voss was assembling a retaliatory fleet. Not 12,000 ships this time, 120,000, 10 times the force that we had just barely defeated. The largest military mobilization in the recorded history of the galaxy. The news should have broken us. By every rational measure, it should have sent humanity into despair. We had lost a quarter of our fleet and hundreds of thousands of lives defeating the first wave, and now a force 10 times larger was coming. The math was worse than before. The odds were impossible. Humanity responded the way it always does to impossible odds. We got to work. The Black Armada was rebuilt, larger and stronger than before. The wreckage of Velthari ships from the battle became raw material for new construction. Our engineers tore apart alien technology and figured out how it worked, then figured out how to make it better. Within 6 months, our new ships carried a hybrid of human and Velthari systems, combining the raw kinetic fury of our railguns with the energy efficiency of Dominion reactors. We were building faster than we had ever built before, because now the shipyards were not secret. The entire species knew what was coming, and the entire species was building. But the most important breakthrough came from the singularity torpedoes. Our physicists studied the micro-black holes that the torpedoes generated and discovered something that changed everything. The gravitational distortions created by the weapons were not random. They followed patterns. Patterns that, when mapped correctly, described a method of folding space, faster than light travel. The holy grail that humanity had been chasing for centuries, and the Velthari had been using for millennia, was hidden inside our own weapons. Within a year, the first human faster-than-light drive was tested on a small frigate that jumped from the orbit of Mars to the orbit of Neptune in 4 seconds. The crew reported that the experience felt like falling sideways through a dream. The drive worked. Humanity was no longer trapped in its own solar system. I was given command of the first extrasolar expedition, not a scouting mission, not a scientific survey, a liberation campaign. Because we had studied the Dominion's maps, stolen from the wreckage of their ships, and we knew where their conquered species were being held. We knew which worlds were enslaved, and we were going to free them. The first system we reached was called Aerith 4 in the Velthari catalogs. It was home to a species called the Erithani, a gentle people who had been conquered and enslaved 800 years ago. 8 centuries of forced labor, cultural erasure, and systematic cruelty. When the Black Armada, now 20,000 ships strong, jumped into the system, the Velthari garrison took one look at our fleet and ran. They did not even try to fight. The black ships had become a symbol, and that symbol meant something simple. It meant that the age of easy conquest was over. I will remember what happened next for as long as I live. We broadcast a message to the planet below. I wrote it myself because I wanted it to be right. It said, "We are humans, from a world called Earth. We were ordered to kneel, and we refused. You have been kneeling for 800 years. You do not have to kneel anymore. You are free." The response took almost an hour. The Erithani were cautious. They had been betrayed before, by Velthari agents posing as liberators, and they did not trust easily. But when they finally believed us, when they understood that the ships in their sky were real, and the people inside them had come to break their chains, I watched an entire civilization weep. Their transmissions were not words. They were sounds. Music, I think, or something deeper than music. A frequency of joy and grief, so intertwined that I could not tell where one ended and the other began. We stayed in the Aerith system for 2 weeks. We helped the Erithani rebuild their communication networks, provided medical supplies, and shared everything we knew about fighting the Velthari. Before we left, their leader, a figure so old that even the Erithani did not know her exact age, asked me why we had come. Why had we risked our ships, our people, our species, for strangers on the other side of the galaxy? I told her the truth. We came because nobody came for us. When the Velthari arrived at Earth, there was no fleet in the sky to help us, no allies, no galactic community riding to our rescue. We fought alone because we had no choice, and we decided, after we won, that no species would ever have to fight alone again. The liberation of Aerith 4 was the beginning. Over the next 2 years, the Black Armada jumped from system to system, freeing species that the Velthari had enslaved for centuries. The Drovathi, massive beings with bodies like living stone, who had been forced to mine their own worlds until the planets were hollow shells. The Kiel-Sori, a species of artists and musicians whose entire culture the Velthari had tried to erase, burning their instruments, banning their songs, punishing any expression of beauty or joy. The Tessari, a race of aquatic beings who had been drained of the oceans they needed to survive and confined to artificial tanks for labor purposes. Each liberation added strength to our cause. They constructed shipyards in asteroid fields with a speed and skill that made our best engineers look like amateurs. The Keel Sori, whose art the Velthari had tried to destroy, turned out to be brilliant communication specialists. They could coordinate fleet movements across light years with a precision that our technology could not match. The Tassari, once returned to water, became the finest navigators in the Alliance, mapping faster-than-light routes that cut travel times in half. We offered them a choice, the same choice that had been taken from them centuries ago, and they chose to stand with us. The Free Galactic Compact, as it came to be called, was an alliance of equals. 14 species, each contributing what they did best, united by a shared refusal to live under the Dominion's boot. Humanity did not lead by force. We led by example. We were the species that proved the Velthari could lose. And in a galaxy that had known nothing but the Dominion's rule for 3,000 years, that proof was more powerful than any weapon. As the Velthari's retaliatory armada grew closer to completion, I finally learned the truth about Harold. Claire Ashton called me to a meeting on the Defiance, alone, and told me what was behind the red-painted door in the lowest level of the ship. Harold was not a weapon, it was a message, a quantum-encoded broadcast designed to reach every point in the galaxy simultaneously, transmitted on frequencies that could not be blocked, jammed, or intercepted by any technology the Velthari possessed. It contained everything: humanity's history, from our first steps on the plains of Africa to our stand against the Dominion, our music, our art, our science, our literature, our failures and our cruelties and our small, stubborn, beautiful triumphs. It contained detailed tactical analysis of every weakness in the Velthari military that we had discovered. It contained instructions for building weapons from commonly available materials. It contained the mathematics of faster-than-light travel. It was a blueprint for revolution, wrapped in the story of a species that had refused to surrender. Claire looked at me and said, "The Velthari can defeat a fleet, Daniel. They can conquer a planet. They can enslave a species. But they cannot stop an idea. And once Harold goes out, every enslaved being in every corner of this galaxy will know that resistance is possible. They will know how to fight, and they will know that they are not alone." I authorized the broadcast. Harold went out at the speed of quantum entanglement, everywhere at once, unstoppable and irreversible. The Velthari tried to block it. They could not. They tried to jam it. They could not. They tried to punish the species that received it. Species that had been enslaved for centuries suddenly remembered what freedom tasted like, and they wanted it back. The Velthari found themselves fighting on every front, their forces stretched across 9,000 systems, trying to hold together an empire that was coming apart at the seams. When the retaliatory armada finally arrived at Sol, 120,000 ships strong, it was not met by a desperate, outnumbered human fleet fighting alone. The Black Armada was there, 20,000 ships rebuilt and upgraded beyond anything the First Fleet had been. And beside us, ships from 14 allied species, Drovathi dreadnoughts, massive and slow and nearly indestructible. Keel-Sori communication ships, coordinating the allied fleet with impossible precision. Tasari navigators, guiding attack wings through faster-than-light jumps that let them strike and vanish, and strike again, from a completely different angle. And across the Dominion, the fires that Harold had lit were burning out of control. Cyrith Voss had sent 120,000 ships to crush humanity, and in doing so, had left the rest of the Empire undefended. Stolen weapons. The tactical information from the Herald broadcast. They fought with the knowledge that somewhere across the galaxy, a species called humanity was fighting too, and that made them brave enough to try. The final battle was the largest engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. It raged across the solar system for 3 days. The losses on both sides were staggering, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Because the Velthari were not fighting one species anymore. They were fighting every species they had ever wronged, every chain they had ever placed, every world they had ever burned, every song they had ever silenced. It all came back. All of it. And it came back with interest. The same bridge where I had said now and started a war. The same chair. The same view of the stars. No longer blocked by an enemy fleet. The question that had haunted me since Claire Ashton first said the words, Black Armada, in that underground bunker beneath the ocean. Could we win? We could. We did. Not alone. Never alone again. 5 years after the Battle of Saul, I stood on Earth, in Geneva, at the dedication of a monument. It was a black stone pillar, polished until it reflected the sky, bearing the names of every human being who had died in the defense of Earth. There were so many names that they covered the stone from base to top in letters so small you had to stand close to read them. At the base, an inscription had been carved in 340 languages, including Velthari. It read, "They told us to kneel. We stood, and we brought others to stand with us." My daughter Lily was there, with her children. 2 of them, a boy and a girl, too young to understand what the monument meant. They played on the grass nearby while the speeches were given, and I watched them run and laugh and chase each other in the sunlight, and I thought that this was what it had all been for. Not glory, not revenge, not even survival, though survival mattered more than anything. It was for this. For children playing in the sun on a planet that was still free. For the simple, ordinary, unimaginable gift of a future. I am old now. The galaxy is not perfect. It never will be. The Free Galactic Compact is messy, argumentative, and fractious, the way any alliance of free peoples will always be. There are disputes. There are disagreements. There are days when I wonder if any of us know what we are doing. But there is no dominion. There are no chains. There is no voice from the sky ordering anyone to kneel. And when the old darkness presses in, when the arguments get loud, and the problems seem too big, I remember what we did, what we built, what we became. Humanity's greatest weapon was never the Black Armada. It was never the Singularity torpedoes, or the drone swarms, or even Herald. Though Herald changed the galaxy in ways we are still discovering, our greatest weapon was simpler than all of that. It was the belief, held in the bones of every human being who has ever lived, that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how ancient, no matter how terrifying, has the right to tell a free people to kneel. They came for Earth, expecting cattle. They found wolves, and the wolves had friends.